In 1982, somewhere in Akron, Ohio, a passenger tire came off a production line. Nobody filmed it. As far as I can tell, there was no ceremony, no speech, no photograph in the paper the next morning. It was a tire. It went into a stack with other tires. It was the last one. After that, the city that had invented the American tire industry never built another passenger tire again. Akron did not make tires the way other towns made things. Akron was tires. 4 of the largest rubber companies on earth were headquartered inside the same city limits: Goodyear, Firestone, B.F. Goodrich, General Tire. At the peak, 37,100 people in that one city went to work in rubber. 20 years later, 90% of those jobs were gone. This is the story of how that happened. It involves a doctor with a bad investment, 10,000 men standing at a factory gate in February, a French tire the Americans refused to build, and a recall of 14.5 million tires that killed more than 40 people and cost the company $500,000. 500,000. Hold that number. We will get there. Start in 1871 with a man named Benjamin Franklin Goodrich. He was a doctor. He had been a surgeon in the Civil War, and when he came out of it, he did what a lot of men did in that period, which was to look around for something to invest in. What he found was rubber. Rubber in 1871 was not the material you are thinking of. It was closer to a promise than a product. Charles Goodyear had worked out vulcanization back in 1839, which is the process of cooking raw rubber with sulfur so it stops turning into glue in the summer and a brick in the winter. That discovery made rubber usable. It did not make Charles Goodyear rich. He died in 1860, deep in debt, and we will come back to him because his name is about to get borrowed by people who never met him. Goodrich had a small rubber operation in New York that was not working. So he went looking for a town that would pay him to move. Akron said yes. Local businessmen put up money to bring him there, and if you look at a map from that period, you can see why the deal made sense to both sides. Akron sat on the Ohio and Erie Canal. It had rail. It was close to coal. It was a town with good connections and not enough industry, which is exactly the kind of town that will write a check to a stranger with a factory. In March of 1871, he started making rubber in Akron. Fire hose mostly. Belting. Not tires, because in 1871 there was almost nothing to put a tire on. Then the bicycle happened. Then the automobile happened. And a town that had gambled on a doctor's failing rubber company found itself sitting on top of the single most important industrial material of the coming century. In 1898, a man named Frank Seiberling bought a factory in Akron with borrowed money and started a rubber company. He needed a name, and he picked one of the strangest names in American business history. He called it Goodyear. Charles Goodyear had been dead for 38 years. He had never set foot in the company. He had no stake in it, no family involvement, nothing. Seiberling simply took the name of the man who invented vulcanization and put it on the door, because it sounded like it meant something. It worked. It is still working. There is a very good chance you have that name on your car right now. 2 years later, in 1900, a 31-year-old named Harvey Firestone started Firestone Tire and Rubber in the same city. Firestone had something Goodrich and Seiberling did not. He had Henry Ford. The two of them became genuine friends, close enough that Firestone, Ford, and Thomas Edison used to go camping together and got written up in the newspapers for it, and Firestone sold Ford tires. When Ford figured out how to build a car that ordinary people could afford, and then built millions of them, a rubber company in Akron was attached to the bottom of that entire wave. In 1915, General Tire and Rubber was founded there too. 4 companies. 1 city. And what happened to Akron next is one of the fastest transformations of any American city on record. In 1910, the population was about 70,000. By 1920, it was over 200,000. More than doubled. In 10 years. They came from everywhere, but a huge share of them came up out of Appalachia, from West Virginia and Kentucky and the Hill counties, walking away from farms and coal mines toward a factory job that paid cash every week. Whole extended families relocated. Akron built housing as fast as it could and could not build it fast enough. People rented beds in shifts, sleeping in the hours somebody else was at the plant. If you talk to anyone who grew up there in that era, or read what they wrote down, the thing they all mention first is the smell. Rubber processing puts a heavy, sweet chemical smell into the air, and it does not go away. It sat over the whole city, and almost without exception, they say the same thing about it. They say it smelled like money. It cost something, though, and tire work in that era was brutal in a very specific way. It starts in the mill room, where raw rubber gets mixed with carbon black and sulfur and oil in machines that look like enormous rollers. Carbon black is a fine powder and it gets into everything. Men came off that job black from the hairline down, and it did not wash off properly. It wore off over days. Then the rubber goes through calendars which press it into sheets and force it into fabric. Then a tire builder stands at a rotating drum and assembles the tire by hand, layer by layer, ply by ply, bead by bead. This was skilled work. A good builder could feel when a layer was seated wrong. Then curing. The green tire goes into a mold and gets cooked under pressure and steam, and that is where the heat comes from. Curing rooms in an Akron summer were an ordeal that men described for the rest of their lives. The pay was good. That is not in dispute, and nobody who took those jobs was confused about the trade. A man could come out of a hollow in West Virginia with no trade at all and inside a year be making enough to buy a house and put a car in front of it. But you paid for it with your lungs and your hands and your hearing, and you paid for it on your feet, in heat, 6 days out of 7. That is the deal Akron ran on for 60 years, and it is why, when the company came for the 6-hour day, 10,000 people took it personally. Now I want to slow down, because the next part is the piece of this story that almost never gets told, and I think it is the most important thing that ever happened in Akron. Late in 1935, Goodyear management put forward a proposal. They wanted to cut wages, and they wanted to move the shift from 6 hours to 8. Understand what the 6-hour day meant there. Akron had run 6-hour shifts since the 20s. It meant 4 shifts a day instead of 3, which meant more men employed. Moving to 8 hours would have wiped out something like 1,200 jobs. The workers pushed back and management dropped it. But tire sales were falling, and Goodyear went ahead and laid off around 700 men anyway. On February the 14th, 1936, the strike started. It lasted about a month, through one of the colder stretches of an Ohio winter, and it did something that had not really been done before at that scale. The men did not just walk out. They surrounded the plant. There were multiple gates, and the picket line went around all of them. At its height, as many as 10,000 people were out there. And they were not all rubber workers. They came from every trade in the city. Because in Akron, if the rubber plant stopped, everything stopped, and everyone knew it. They built shelters out of scrap to stand in. They kept fires going in barrels. Food came in from families and from other unions and from people who just brought it. Now here is where it gets strange, and I promise this is real. The origin of the sit-down strike, the tactic that would change American labor for a generation, traces back to a baseball game in Akron. Union men from different factories played each other in a league. At one game, the umpire assigned to them was not a union man, so the players refused to play, and rather than walk off the field, which would have just ended the game, they sat down on it. That was it. That was the idea. Do not leave. Stay exactly where you are and stop working. Applied inside a factory, it is a devastating tactic. If you walk out, the company can bring in replacement workers. If you sit down at your machine and refuse to move, they cannot run the plant without physically removing you, and every hour of that is a photograph nobody wants taken. Akron sit-downs came before the famous Flint sit-down strike of 1936 and 1937. The tactic that beat General Motors was worked out first by rubber workers in Ohio and by a group of ball players who did not like the umpire. The strike ended with Goodyear giving in on the main points. Layoffs by seniority, the 6-hour day, regular meetings between management and the union. And in about a month of this, in freezing weather, with 10,000 people in the street, there were no deaths and no serious injuries. Say that out loud because the version of labor history most of us absorbed is all violence and Pinkertons. Akron in 1936 was 10,000 people who stood outside in February until the largest rubber company in the world sat down at a table. They did not win on sentiment, by the way. They won on leverage. A rubber plant is a continuous process. The mixers run, the calendars run, the curing presses run, and stopping is expensive in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who has not worked in one. Rubber left sitting in the wrong stage of the process is not paused. It is ruined. Which meant that in 1936, a rubber worker in Akron had more power than almost any other industrial worker in America, and for 1 month that year they used all of it. That is the high water mark. Not 1964, when there were more of them and they were paid better. 1936, standing in the snow, holding the most valuable industrial real estate in the country hostage without breaking a window. By the mid-30s, 4 companies controlled the American tire business almost completely. Goodyear, Firestone, B.F. Goodrich, and U.S. Rubber together supplied 80% of the tires in the United States. 3 of those 4 were headquartered in Akron. Then the war, then the boom, then 20 years of Americans buying cars in numbers nobody had ever seen. Akron's population hit its peak in 1960, and in 1964, rubber employment in that city reached 37,100. Think about what that is. Not a factory, not an industry, a city where you could stand on a corner and every third adult who walked past you worked in rubber, or was married to somebody who did, or was raising a kid who was going to. It was, without any argument, the rubber capital of the world. 1964 is the top. Everything from here is downhill, and the reason is a tire that was invented in France. A radial tire is built differently from what the Americans were making. The old design, the bias ply, has its internal cords running diagonally across the tire. It works, and it is cheap to build, and the whole American industry was tooled for it down to the last machine. A radial runs the cords straight across, at 90 degrees, and adds a stiff belt underneath the tread. The result is not a small improvement. A radial roughly doubled tire life. It cut fuel consumption, it handled better, and it was much less likely to blow out and put a family into a ditch. Michelin developed it in France after the Second World War. By the early 60s, it was plainly the better tire, and it was spreading across Europe. The American companies knew all of this. They were not fools and they were not uninformed. They looked at the radial and they did the arithmetic and they came to a conclusion. Retooling would cost too much. Their factories were built for bias ply. Their machines, their processes, their trained workforce, all of it. Converting meant enormous capital spending on plants that were already profitable making the old tire. And the old tire was selling fine. Why spend hundreds of millions to replace a product that was making money? For a product with thinner margins that lasted twice as long and therefore sold half as often. That last part is the trap, and to be fair to them, it was a real one. The radial was better for the customer in a way that was worse for the manufacturer. A tire that lasts twice as long is half the replacement business. The American companies were not just being lazy, they were protecting a model that worked. Now, retooling is one of those words that slides past you like a line item on a budget. So let me be concrete about what it actually meant. A bias ply plant is not a building with generic machines in it. The tire building drums are specified for that construction. The molds are cut for those tires, the curing schedules are set for that compound, the inspection equipment is calibrated for that failure mode, and the tire builder standing at the drum has 15 years of muscle memory in a construction method that is about to be worthless. Converting a plant to radials meant replacing much of that and retraining all of it in a factory that was currently profitable to make a product that would sell in smaller quantities. Now put yourself in the chair. You are running a company with shareholders and a quarterly number. Somebody hands you that proposal in 1963. Most people say no. They said no. They protected it right up until 1968. In 1968, Consumer Reports tested radials against bias ply tires and published what it found. The radial won, and not narrowly. American car buyers read it. And more importantly, American car companies read it and started demanding radials on new vehicles. The tooling problem did not go away because the market changed its mind. The American manufacturers now had to convert, at speed, under pressure, having deliberately not started years earlier when they could have done it calmly. Some of them converted badly, which brings us to Firestone. Between January of 1971 and March of 1978, Firestone built 23.5 million tires in a line called the Firestone 500. It was a steel-belted radial. It was the company's answer to the problem. There was a flaw in it. The rubber compound and the brass-coated steel wire inside the tire did not bond properly. Over time, in heat, under load, the layers came apart. The tread would separate from the body of the tire, or the steel belts inside would come loose. When that happens at highway speed, the tire does not go flat. It comes apart. There is a difference, and it matters. A flat tire is a bad afternoon. A tread separation at 70 miles an hour is a strip of steel belted rubber leaving the wheel while the car is still moving, usually taking the fender with it, usually while the driver is steering with one hand. On a car with a high center of gravity, it rolls. The people this killed were not doing anything wrong. They were driving to work on tires that came on the vehicle. And this is the number that matters more than any other in this story. Of those 23.5 million tires, 4.1 million were adjusted, which is the industry term for a tire brought back under warranty. That is an adjustment rate of 17.5%. On Firestone's other radial lines, the rate was 5.5%, more than 3 times higher, on one product line, for 7 years. And Firestone knew. Since 1972, the company was aware it had a problem with these tires. They made changes on the assembly line. They kept selling them. By 1978, it was in front of Congress. House hearings ran from the 19th to the 23rd of May, and again on the 10th of July. The subcommittee's conclusion was not ambiguous. It found that Firestone had, in its words, early knowledge of the serious failure propensities of the tire, and it described the company as having made a clear and conscious choice. On November the 29th, 1978, Firestone recalled 14.5 million tires. It was the largest tire recall that had ever happened. The failures are linked to hundreds of injuries and more than 40 known deaths. On May the 12th, 1980, Firestone was fined $500,000. 40 people. $500,000. That works out to about $12,500 a life. And I am aware that is a crude way to put it, and I am saying it anyway, because I do not think there is a polite way to describe that ratio. 2 months later, in July of 1980, after management changes, they recalled 5 million more. So the industry was already in trouble when the plants started closing, and once it started, it went quickly. Between 1975 and 1982, one after another, the Big Four shut down passenger tire production in Akron. The work went south, where labor was cheaper and the plants were new and built for radials from the start. Or it did not go anywhere, because the company that owned it had been bought by somebody else. In 1982, the last passenger tire was built in Akron. By 1984, rubber employment in the city was down to 15,400, from 37,120 years earlier. 90% of those jobs, gone. Then the names went too. In 1987, General Tire was sold to Continental, of Germany. At the end of the 80s, Firestone was sold to Bridgestone, of Japan. In 1990, the tire business of B.F. Goodrich went to Michelin, of France. Michelin, the company that built the radial the Americans would not build. It ended up owning the tire operation of the oldest rubber company in Akron, the one started by a Civil War surgeon in 1871. By the 90s, rubber employment in Akron was around 5,000, and Goodyear was the last major tire company headquartered there. Between 2000 and 2007, the number of rubber workers fell by roughly half again. Across the 2 decades from 1970 to 1990, Akron lost about 35,000 manufacturing jobs. Akron's population peaked in 1960. The 2020 census counted 190,469 people. The city has lost more than a third of the people it once had. I want to end this honestly because Akron is not a ghost town and I am not going to pretend it is. Goodyear is still headquartered there. That matters, and the city fought to keep it. There is a polymer industry in the greater Akron area now, roughly 200 firms employing about 10,000 people, built on the technical knowledge that never fully left. Metro Akron has actually grown slightly since 2000, which puts it in a very small group of Ohio metro areas. So this is not a story with no survivors. But look at what actually happened here. An American city invented an industry, not participated in it, invented it. 4 global companies, 1 set of streets. 37,000 people who made the thing that every car in the country rolled on. And then a better tire showed up. And the men who ran those companies looked at the cost of building it and decided the old way had a few more good years in it. They were right, for about 6 years. That is the whole thing. Nobody was stupid. Nobody committed a crime by refusing to retool. It was a defensible business decision, made carefully by serious people, and it took an entire city down with it. And when the bill came due, the companies were sold to Germany, Japan, and France, and the people who had actually built the industry were told the jobs had moved south. There was one moment in this story when the people of Akron proved they could change the outcome. February of 1936, 10,000 of them at the gates in the cold for a month until the largest rubber company on earth gave them the 6-hour day. They knew how to do that. Nobody ever put 10,000 people at the gates over a tire design. Go look at your car. Check the sidewall. Goodyear, Firestone, B.F. Goodrich, General. If it says one of those, that name was invented in a single Ohio city by 4 companies that were once neighbors. 3 of the 4 now belong to somebody else.